inside a bus, the roof would stay on and just the windows blow out. So this again is not normal. Another explanation for that cut could be that it was made by a shaped explosive cutter charge. The top of the bus appears to have been very cleanly cut off in an exact straight line.
A white van from a demolition company called Kingstar is seen and photographed parked at the side of the bus immediately after the explosion, and a mysterious witness, Richard Jones, gives an account of what he says happened to the bus on camera, which is something that normally would not be allowed by the police unless it was part of a film training exercise. Then, after a spate of very contradictory TV and newspaper interviews within a very short space of time, that makes sure everyone now believes the explosion was caused by a suicide bomber on the bus, Richard Jones disappears from view. However, and of particular interest, some newspapers, including the UK's Sunday Mail on the 10th of July 2005, reported that Richard Jones served an apprenticeship at an explosives factory in Ayrshire. Richard Jones' statements about the suicide bomber are very suspicious for two reasons. First, because they are so inconsistent and contradictory that they are not believable. And second, because criminals usually accuse someone else to divert attention away from themselves. Is that what Richard Jones did? He says that he and 11 other people got off the bus just before it exploded. Were the 12 of them a team, with the other 11 there to cover up what Richard Jones was doing as he planted a bomb? Another strange statement he made to the Sun newspaper, reported in the 8th of July 2005 edition, is that he got off the bus because he had reached his destination. How could he possibly have reached his destination on a bus that had been diverted from its normal route, unless he was part of the mock terrorism exercise team and got off the bus as planned in Tavistock Square after planting a bomb just before it was detonated? Does he work for Kingstar? Kingstar, whose white van was parked next to the bus, is a company that specialises in controlled demolitions, and Richard Jones said he served an apprenticeship at an explosives factory in Ayrshire. Was the Kingstar van there as part of Peter Power and his customers' training mock terrorism drill to supervise the mock explosion that became real?
Kingstar took part in the BBC Two hit piece Conspiracy Files 7/7 and stated that the back of their van was caved in and needed to be repaired.
When the explosion happened, the back of the doors got caved in and the roof was dented through, for whatever reason, I'm not sure, but something hit the top of the roof.
But if you inspect the photos taken on 7/7, there is no sign of any damage to the van. Even the relatively fragile plastic rear lights are intact, so it appears that their statements cannot be trusted.
If Hasib Hussain was supposed to have been on that number 30 bus, registration LX03BUF, how would it be possible for him to get the exact bus that would get him to one of the 4 locations where the mock terrorist exercise would be taking place, when that bus was diverted from its normal route to Tavistock Square, unless he had been recruited to play the part of a mock terrorist and told exactly which bus to get, where and at what time, by the people who organised the mock terrorism exercise and who knew the bus would be diverted to Tavistock Square? The odds against that happening by coincidence are unbelievable, and thus it is not possible that it was a coincidence. Another unbelievable coincidence is that all of the CCTV cameras at all 4 of the blast sites were not working that day. The 4 CCTV cameras on the number 30 bus were, just like the Israeli Variant Systems ones on the Underground, not working, and there are no reliable witnesses who can place Hasib Hussein on the number 30 bus. Richard Jones is an unreliable witness whose physical descriptions of the man he says was the suicide bomber does not fit with Hasib Hussein's appearance or what he was wearing that day. So there is no proof that Hasib Hussein was either on that bus or blew it up. Even so, he has been tried and wrongfully found guilty of blowing up the number 30 bus by the government-organized and controlled media machine, without a shred of real evidence.
They claim to have found Hasib Hussein's ID in Tavistock Square. However, they also state that ID from another of the 4, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, was found at all 4 separate blast locations. He cannot possibly have been in 2, never mind 3 or all 4 locations at the same time, proving that these items were planted after the blasts.
How could their IDs have survived suicide bomb blasts? Millions of people are aware of the magic fireproof Mohammed Atta passport that was planted at the World Trade Center on 9/11. In light of these incidents, if ID from Hasib Hussein was found at Tavistock Square, it does not necessarily mean that he was on the bus and not somewhere else, or, if he was on the bus, that he blew the bus up.
There is no credible witness who has placed Hasib Hussein on that number 30 bus, and that includes Lisa French, who took 5 years before she supposedly remembered seeing him, and then gets the bag wrong, saying it was a square laptop bag, not a big rucksack. Also, people who were sitting around the seat he is reported to have been sitting in did not see him. Does this look like a laptop bag to you?
What has happened to the presumption of innocence, and being considered innocent until proven guilty and convicted by a jury of your peers in court, that has always been the mainstay of British justice? The most likely case is that the number 30 bus had been pre-rigged with explosives during its previous service, when the CCTV cameras were disabled. The CCTV systems on stagecoach buses are normally either the Israeli company Variant Systems RP12001 or Timespace X200. A witness, Richmal Marie Oates Whitehead, aged 35, who worked at the BMA in Tavistock Square and was hailed as a heroine for her actions during the London bombings, said she heard 2 explosions on the bus. The controlled media immediately went on the offensive and did a character assassination of the heroine, because her testimony did not fit with the official story, and she died unexpectedly shortly afterwards. However, other witnesses also reported a second explosion on the bus. Richmal's and other witnesses' testimonies would account for pre-planted explosives and a bomb being planted later on 7/7/2005. What we can be certain about, though, is that, either on the bus or elsewhere, Hasib Hussein, like the other 3 Muslim patsies, was murdered. 7th chapter title: Pre-planted explosives. Witnesses of the tube train explosions state that there were no Muslims with backpacks and no backpacks or bags left unattended on the trains in the carriages that blew up, and the floors of the trains blew upwards from underneath, not downwards, as would be the case with explosives inside the trains.
I just got on the train, sat down reading the newspaper about us getting the Olympics in 2012, and I've had quite a good feeling about everything. Sitting on the train, going to my audition. Must have been not much longer than 30 seconds. All of a sudden, it didn't feel like I was on the train anymore. Something was very, very different. It was very strange. I had this very heavy feel to it, this very heavy kind of not of this world feel to it. As I was getting off the train, I noticed that there was a hole, and the hole was as if there was a bomb or the explosion had burst up through the floor of the train, and that was just about there.
Explosives under the train floors, powerful enough to rupture the carriage floors and bend them upwards, would also lift the carriages up off the rails and derail them, as did happen. Those explosives were not homemade, but military-grade high explosives that would not be available to Muslim suicide bombers. The official story was that they used homemade explosives, which has later been proven to be a lie.
The presence of military-grade high explosives was confirmed by Christophe Chabot, head of the French Anti-Terrorism Coordination Unit, as well as Scotland Yard's Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Brian Paddick. Forensic investigations are a scientific process. The discovery of military-grade explosives, confirmed by experienced professionals, doesn't just happen by accident. They also stated that the bombs were detonated by timing devices, not by suicide bombers. This is the Russell Square tube carriage that Jermaine Lindsay allegedly blew up. Further proof that the government lied about the explosives is the fact that the explosives that were used could not have been homemade in a bath TATP, because TATP explodes without generating any flames or heat, and we know from the famous photograph of the woman in the Burns mask that the explosives that were used burned her and others.
So we know from reliable eyewitnesses who can be traced that there were no backpack homemade bombs or Muslim bombers inside the tube train carriages that blew up, and that the floors blew upwards, so the bombs, which were made from military-grade explosives, must have been fastened underneath the floors of the train carriages. Only people having access to the tube trains during the times that the trains were not running would be able to plant those bombs under the train floors. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli finance minister, said that he was warned by Scotland Yard not to leave his hotel room on the morning of 7/7/2005 before the first explosion was reported, implying that they had foreknowledge of the plan. Scotland Yard then quickly denied being the ones who had provided the warning, but have not told us who did warn Netanyahu if they did not. Why was Benjamin Netanyahu warned, but not the British people who pay their wages and whom they are paid to protect? Was it because it would have spoiled their evil plan to murder British people, to change the nation's mind about British troops fighting in the Middle East? 2 weeks later, the head of the Israeli Mossad, General Meir Dagan, said that he had warned Benjamin Netanyahu at 08:40 a.m. on 7/7/2005, 10 minutes before the first blast occurred. How did he know what was going to happen in London if Scotland Yard did not warn him? Did he wait to warn Benjamin Netanyahu until it was too late to warn the British people, so as not to spoil their evil plan? Was the London bombing a covert MI5 operation, or an Israeli Mossad operation, or a joint operation by both of them? The British people have the right to know. Tony Blair said on the day of the explosions that
we know that these people act in the name of Islam,
when there was no proof whatsoever of who had done it, therefore indicating he possibly had foreknowledge of the plan and who they intended to blame and the reason why they were going to blame the Muslims. As proof that this was a slip-up and needed covering up, look at how the BBC later falsely reported his actual words, giving further proof that the BBC is a government propaganda machine and the coverage was organised, exactly as Michael Portillo said it would be in the BBC Panorama programme in May 2004. Later that same day, Ephraim Halevi, a former head of the Israeli Mossad, wrote in an article published on the Jerusalem Post website at 18:10 p.m. London time that the attacks had been carried out simultaneously with near-perfect execution. How did he know they had only been near-perfect? How could he have known what the perfect results should have been in order to know that the actual results were not perfect, unless he was in on the plot? How many more people had they intended to murder in order for it to be considered perfect execution? How did he know, at least 2 days before the London authorities released the information on the 9th of July, that the bombs were detonated simultaneously, unless he was in on the plot? As proof that this too was a slip-up, the Jerusalem Post article in question was completely removed from their website after people began to ask similar questions. The following day, Police Commissioner Ian Blair also made a slip-up on camera and said that there were 4 miserable bombers, and then very quickly corrected himself, showing that he too possibly had foreknowledge of the plan to use 4 Muslims as patsies.
If London could survive the Blitz, it can survive 4 miserable bombers like this. I'm not saying there are 4 bombers, 4 miserable events like this.
We are told that the first reports were of an electrical power surge that occurred, and then later we were told that there were bombs that exploded on the tube trains and that it was an Al-Qaeda terrorist attack, with Muslim suicide bombers carrying backpack homemade explosive devices onto the tube trains. A couple of weeks later, a Brazilian contract electrician is brutally and publicly murdered on a tube train, and again we are told lies by the police and media about him. He was a contract electrician. For whom had he been working, and what had he been working on in the days leading up to the 7th of July 2005? Remember that the first reports from the media about 7/7/2005 were of an electrical power surge, and John Charles de Menezes was a contract electrician. Was he hired as part of the terrorist exercises 1,000 people to wire up devices for mock explosions to be set off by a power surge? Did he see the explosive devices being fastened under the tube train carriage floors and later realize what had really happened and was starting to talk about it? Did they, the hierarchy enslaving him, publicly execute him to shut him up and as a warning to others to keep their mouths shut? We have been unable to find out where he worked. We know about his cousins who live in London and his family coming over from Brazil, but we do not know where he worked. Why?
The murder of John Charles de Menezes is also very suspicious, because of what the authorities did, or, in reality, what they didn't do that day, which should have been standard operating procedure if they really did believe he was a suicide bomber wearing explosives. If they really believed he was wearing explosives, they would absolutely not have let him get on a bus or a tube train. They would have taken him down when he was in the middle of a street, equidistant from the buildings on either side of the street, in order to minimize the risk to the neighbors. They absolutely would not have let him get on a bus unless it was all scripted as another psyop to reinforce in the public's mind the attacks of 7/7 2 weeks previously. They let him get on a red bus to remind the public of Tavistock Square, and then onto a tube to remind them of the 3 tube bombings and keep the public in a continual state of fear, to make them more easily manipulated and amenable to allowing more anti-terrorist legislation to be passed, to remove even more of their freedom, and more draconian measures to be taken by the police to protect them. It would also send a message that if anyone talked, this would happen to them too.
Who is the person calling himself Richard Jones and claiming to have been next to the suicide bomber on the bus and a witness to the bus bombing? And why did he tell so many lies? Why did Peter Power smirk, grin and giggle when he spoke about the coincidence that the exercise had turned out to be real, when lots of people had been killed and injured? What is funny about that? The probability of the 7/7/2005 drill and attack coinciding without being planned to coincide in a 10-year period is 1 chance in 37155992000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000000. I wonder why the media aren't investigating the drill. Why are Peter Power, Verint Systems, Richard Jones, Commissioner Ian Blair, the anti-terrorist branch who shot and murdered these innocent people, the Israeli Mossad, Tony Blair, and the government itself not under investigation for these horrendous crimes? 8th chapter title. Conclusion. The times of the trains and tube trains on that day have been carefully checked. The first train after 0740 am left Luton at 0756 am and arrived at King's Cross Thameslink station at 0842 am. The 3 tube trains that blew up left King's Cross Underground station at 0835 am, the eastbound Circle Line train number 204. 0842 am, the westbound Circle Line train number 216. 0848 am, the Piccadilly Line train south. It was therefore impossible for any of the 4 accused Muslims to have caught the tube trains that blew up. If we have at least 3 of the 4 suicide bombers being shot dead at Canary Wharf, and we know they weren't on the tube trains because the 0740 am train from Luton to King's Cross was cancelled that day, and the photo of them outside Luton Station at 07:21:54 am is a fake, and that Hasib Hussain was part of the mock terrorism exercise, then we have overwhelming proof that the 4 accused Muslims were patsies and are innocent, and that it was an inside job, and that, like Lee Harvey Oswald, they too have been murdered to silence them. Whether the bombings were done by MI5, the Israeli Mossad, or both of them and or others has yet to be determined. But the one thing that we can be sure of is that it was not done by 4 young Muslims.
The sham inquest, in which there were no autopsies, and which never looked into who carried out the bombings, showed even more holes in the government's official conspiracy theory. It was a complete sham and wasted millions of pounds of your money, from which they all made a fortune. Everything that was revealed in the sham inquest further undermines the official story, and reinforces my findings in the original version of 7/7 Ripple Effect. Absolutely nothing they have said since the film's first release on the 5th of November 2007 has undermined the truth of my film. Everything has confirmed its veracity. The most glaring hole in the government story, demonstrated in the sham inquest, is that there were 3 holes in the Edgware Road tube carriage floor that 3 people fell into, 1 into each hole, and that is the carriage that Mohammed Siddiqui Khan is alleged to have been on. Number 10 in the diagram is Khan. Number 13 is Daniel Biddle. Number 16 is John Tulloch. Please notice that Khan is not near the blast location in the police diagram above.
This gets clarified and resolved at the inquest. At the inquest you've got 3 major holes in the floor, and one of them is about 10 or 15 feet away from the other 2. And these are huge holes, and in all 3 of them somebody falls into the hole. That's the amazing thing. Right. And they describe falling into the hole, but with one of them, the person falls in and is stuck there and dies. And the other 2, they managed to get out again. So we've not only got 3 holes, but we've got accounts of 3 different people falling into those 3 holes. And the position where they put Khan is supposed to be at Edgware Road, is nowhere near any of those holes. He has to be located.
He's the one who last week we suggested wasn't even there.
He wasn't even there, no, of course he wasn't. So he was put on a bunch of 4 seats by himself. They have no one else sitting. No one else sitting around him, because they don't want any witnesses to be questioned saying, no, I didn't see Khan, and no, I'm not blown to bits. So they have him sitting by himself with the rucksack. Has to be on his lap, because that's Biddle's account, Danny Biddle, so he pulls a cord. And if you did that, you wouldn't make a hole in the floor at all. But in any case, the 3 huge holes in the floor are nowhere near Khan.
So you wouldn't make 3 holes in the floor?
Certainly
either.
not. 3 holes in the floor clearly
Biddle
shows a blast underneath the train. That's the key thing. Let me emphasise that in all these train stories, the most haunting, horrific factor that keeps reappearing is people with legs and feet blown off. This is what the government and the media totally ignore throughout this inquest, just as they totally ignored it back in the 2006 Greater London Assembly hearing. They kept hearing the haunting things. Oh, how come my leg's blown off? How come my foot's missing? What we actually need is a map of the train showing everyone with legs and feet missing.
Right.
That would give you a kind of diagram. I think you'd find rather long areas down the centre of the train. You wouldn't find it, as it were, from the centre.
So suggesting that there was explosives planted underneath the train.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Edgware Road, during my extradition journey to Belgravia police station, I was driven down Edgware Road by 3 SO15 anti-terrorist branch officers, and it was full of Muslims, Muslim shops and businesses, and Muslim people shopping and milling around. Ask yourself this: why would a Muslim suicide bomber want to risk blowing up Muslims? How would that advance his cause? In fact, why would Muslims want to blow up anyone in London when Londoners had been demonstrating in vast numbers against the war in the Middle East? It would be absolutely counterproductive. Who gained from it? Certainly not Muslims. The military-industrial oil complex, the weapons manufacturers, the oil companies and the Israelis all gained from it. The Muslims did not. Back now to the sham inquest. There were no autopsies. The incredible timing of the De Boer contract for the mortuary needs to be mentioned here in relation to the bombings. Based in Northamptonshire in the UK, the company De Boer had already completed several contracts for the Metropolitan Police. The De Boer team spent months visiting permanent mortuaries and attending meetings with London Resilience to suggest a suitable structure and interior design. 6 months later, on July the 6th, 2005, a document arrived at De Boer's UK headquarters, finalising what had been agreed for a future crisis response. Within 24 hours, the plan was being realised and implemented, with the creation of a temporary mortuary in the grounds of the Honourable Artillery Company near Moorgate Underground Station in central London. Source: London's response to 7/7, David Donegan, Office of the Strategic Health Authorities at an NHS. The following conversation that took place in the Lady in Justice Hallett sham inquest demonstrates how it was clearly a sham and a cover-up because of things like this. Mr. Chowdhury stated, "I have not seen the post-mortem report, but I thought that she was bleeding from somewhere. So if the post-mortem says that she was not bleeding from anywhere, just had a spinal injury, I will be surprised." He was answered, "Since you ask about the post-mortem, can I simply inform you that, as with all the other casualties of the day, no internal post-mortem was conducted into Gladys Wundoa. So unfortunately, much as we would like the answers to the questions that you've asked, they don't." He then said, I'm absolutely sure that she had had internal injury as well as a spinal injury, and I'm absolutely surprised that a post-mortem has not been done through and through. They replied to him, "Well, Mr. Chowdhury, that isn't a matter to concern